So let's talk about actually moving the camera and how to do that. Now, in our previous course on directing, we examined camera moves and their emotional impact. But in this tutorial, we're going to focus a little bit more on the technical aspects of things. For more examples and details about the emotional and story-based ramifications of moving the camera, go back and check out course number 5 in this series, the directing course. So, how can we move the camera? The way that we move the camera in the Assurance, most of the time, is with a slider. So we're going to have a dedicated movie about that in the next tutorial. But there are tons of other ways to move the camera. A dolly is the conventional method that's been used for decades. This involves laying down a flat surface, usually plywood, and then setting down a track, and then putting a wheeled cart, called a dolly, on that track. A grip or PA will then usually push the camera and camera operator on the dolly to create camera movement. This is what a dolly looked like on the set of Bry Troyer's film, I Love You Puppet Man, which we used in this shot. But we also had to set up all that gear for the comparatively smaller movement in this shot, and also in this one, and so on. As you can imagine, this can be extremely time consuming, and because time on set costs money, dolly shots are quite expensive. And it's not just the setup. When the camera move shifts the distance between the subject and the camera, the focus will also need to be adjusted. So usually, a first assistant camera person will need to be there to adjust the focus in real time as the camera moves. And again, this adds to the expense of moving the camera. When I first started working on movie sets and saw these huge contraptions, I would always think to myself, this can't possibly be the best way to do this. But the reason why all of this gear is used is because it makes the camera heavy and smooth. And in order to move the camera well, you need weight, a flat, smooth surface, and even movement. So like most of the inefficient things on a film set, this actually is the best way to get things done, at least for the time being. When you do have a camera that moves closer to or further from your subject, be sure to create camera marks. These are little pieces of tape, usually gaff tape, that go on the ground so that the grips moving the camera know where to stop, or so that the first AC knows where focus changes should occur. And a big part of creating a great moving shot is what's in front of the camera. Look at this shot from The Last Emperor. Because the lens is fairly wide, these soldiers on the edge of the frame give us a real sense of motion. But if I mask out these guys and we just see the background, it feels like we're barely moving at all. And of course, one of the most common ways to move the camera is by simply holding it. These are called handheld shots. Now, I didn't do many handheld shots for the Assurance. I kind of wanted the Assurance to have a more slow, brooding feel that also had a lot of polish to it. Handheld shots add a nice shot of energy and humanity into shots, which is great for any shots where the audience's heart should be racing a little. From my experience, I get much better results with handheld shots when I use a shoulder-mounted rig. This consists of putting the camera in a rig that sits on the shoulder of the operator. This allows you to get even more stable and even movement and still retain that kinetic energy. Some people go a step further and use a gimbal to stabilize the camera even more. This can be done with small little rigs for small cameras or with a Movi, Ronin, or Steadicam for bigger cameras. But it should be noted these tools all have a big learning curve, so make sure you either practice and get comfortable using them before production or hire someone that knows how to use them. If you're just starting out, you could also just loosen your tripod head and just kind of float a little bit, like you're doing some random panning and tilting to kind of simulate a true handheld shot. Now, of course, this does feel a little bit fake because you're not actually moving the camera. And it feels even more fake with larger movements. So very small, subtle movements usually work best. This technique is not ideal, but it can work in a pinch if shooting true handheld isn't an option. And speaking of faking it, a lot of newer cinematographers will use a zoom lens to simulate pushing in the camera. I would avoid this practice wherever possible. It just doesn't look or feel very realistic. Now, quick zooms do have their place, like in action scenes, like these in Kill Bill or in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But remember that zooming with the lens doesn't have the same effect as physically moving the camera towards a subject. Note that there are a host of ways to move cameras nowadays, and you could also be really creative with this. A jib or crane can be really helpful when lifting a camera high into the air. Drones are also becoming an increasingly popular way to get amazing shots, as you can see here with these drone shots in the Assurance. These types of shots used to be done only by helicopter, which is expensive and also dangerous. You could also use a wheelchair as a makeshift dolly. We did that here as Heller pushed me while I held my camera in my lap. Now the shot turned out really rough, but we did this very quickly and inexpensively in a fairly remote location and without a big crew. With smaller cameras, I've also used a monopod, which is basically a tripod but with only one leg. Director of photography Elijah Teagues held the camera above his head with a monopod in this shot and chased me as I ran to simulate a large monster's POV. It's pretty effective, and it's a very inexpensive trick. And moving the camera is just hard. It's one of the most common reasons on the Assurance why we did shots over and over and over again. I mean, in this shot, when we slide to the preacher and all these takes of the 16, or this sliding and panning shot of Cordelia, all these multiple takes were just trying to perfect the camera movement in the shot. So even when you get the right gear, and even when you get the right crew with that gear, it takes some practice and maybe even a few takes to get the right shot. It's obviously worth moving the camera to tell a better story. Just make sure that you know what you're getting into when you plan on moving the camera.